George Fox University. How's it going? I am honored to have the opportunity to speak with you today, even though it is virtual. I would have loved to be there in person, but the circumstances are what they are, and we will pray that this crisis passes over soon. I'd like to thank President Robin Baker for the invitation and just for this opportunity to speak on a subject that's not always easy. And so thank you for entrusting me to do this. Let me say that I am fully persuaded that God has called me, among others, to a ministry that focuses on the intersection between faith and politics. And politics is like I said, a very tough subject to broach around the church because sometimes it tends to divide us. But I don't think that has to be the case if we do it in a biblical way. I assume that part of the reason that your leadership invited me is that because Christians in your school need to discuss how to approach civic engagement with all that's going on. It is really important, and I can't impress upon you enough, to have a gospel-centered framework for engaging the public square. Too often we do not have a political theology, but we need to have a political theology when we go out into the public square. My organization, the AND Campaign, is filled with experienced politicos who take the Bible seriously. And we've articulated, not created, but we've articulated a framework for engaging politics faithfully. And we go about it by challenging both parties and challenging all ideologies. So let me give you this warning. If you are a staunch progressive Democrat or a conservative Republican, you're likely to hear something that conflicts with your preferred narrative. You're likely to hear something today that you might not like. But keep in mind that that's what happens, as the Bible shows us, when the gospel confronts human constructs. But what I can tell you is this. Rest assured that I won't be telling you who to vote for. I won't be telling you one side is purely angelic and the other side is demonic. I have absolutely no interest in doing any of that. But what I will be doing is putting both sides through biblical scrutiny to expose where they fall short of the gospel. And they do fall short of the gospel. The Christian public witness is so much more dynamic and so much more brilliant than political conservatism and secular progressivism. Believe me, people, it's not even close. The truth and moral order professed by conservative Republicans is a lesser truth and a lesser moral order than that in the Bible. The love and social justice advocated for by many progressive Democrats is a lesser love and a lesser justice than that which we see in the gospel. You see, when Christians outsource our public witness to a political party, we do ourselves and society a huge disservice. And I hope to show you why that is today. But if you would, turn to Ephesians 4, chapter 4, verses 14 through 15. That's Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 through 15. And it reads, "Then we will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become, in every respect, the mature body of Him who is the head, that is Christ." Speaking the truth in love. Today's subject is about engaging politics with biblical fidelity. And I won't hide the ball. The lesson today, based on biblical doctrine, is that we can't engage politics faithfully without love and truth. That we can't engage, to put it another way, we can't engage faithfully without justice and moral order. That those things work together. We can't choose our political party over gospel imperatives. We can't choose a political ideology over biblical doctrine. As we search for the answers to the problems that afflict our society today, I'm afraid that many Christians are being tossed back and forth by the waves of false cultural doctrine and blown here and there by the winds of flawed pop culture prescriptions. We get exposed to a trending topic or a fancy theory in academia, and we begin to put our faith in political parties and ideologies that sound good or that flatter us, but aren't actually edifying, and that can show no proof of concept. More importantly, they simply aren't biblical, but yet and still, based on the cultural identity of the messenger or the political party of origin, we follow that which is completely unsubstantiated. On the other hand, the gospel of Jesus Christ produces results. First and foremost, it's the key to salvation. But even for those who haven't opened up their Bible to receive that revelation, if they do some outside historical research, they'll find that it can also lay claim to tangible social renewal that can be observed by all. So when it comes to political engagement, if the postmodernists will have their say, if the rugged individualists and the hyper-woke identitarians will throw in their 2 cents, then the people of God best not repeat them. But when we speak on it, the Bible says that we must speak the truth in love. I must ask you first, are Christians speaking the truth in love in politics today? Let's take a recent tragedy. On May 25th at approximately 8:12 p.m. Central Standard Time, in the south central portion of Minneapolis, Minnesota, 46-year-old George Floyd was arrested for allegedly using a counterfeit $20 bill to purchase cigarettes. His face was subsequently pressed against the blacktop with a knee wedged in his neck. He told the officers that he couldn't breathe. He cried out for his mother, and he died. He was killed over a fake $20 bill. 5 image bearers lost a father, and the veneer of impartiality was removed from parts of the American justice system. While there were many peaceful protests around the country, and thank God for those who went out and voiced their concern and even their protest peacefully, some in response to the killing of George Floyd engaged in all manner of performative stunts. Many of these stunts unapproved by the community that was actually in harm's way. They rioted, they looted, they set the cities ablaze, they even assaulted and insulted black police officers, some of whom were taking every measure to deal with these people sensibly. A group in one city smashed the doors of the Ronald McDonald House with families of sick children inside in what they claimed was an act of social justice. You see, Christians should be able to look at the killing of George Floyd and realize that law and order by themselves are insufficient. That law and order must be coupled with justice. Christians should also be able to look at the destruction that happened in many of these cities and realize that that conception of social justice is insufficient. Social justice must be coupled with moral order. And I'm not talking about passivity. I'm not talking about respectability. I'm talking about moral order. What do we Christians have to say? And are we speaking for ourselves, or are we allowing others to speak for us? I don't have to tell you that we're living in a tumultuous socio-political moment where every issue must be politicized and polarized. Common ground is scarce, and far too many Christians are mere partisans with nothing unique or particularly thoughtful to add to the discourse. We're just red or blue soldiers that add more vitriol to the discussion. If we're honest, a large number of us have outsourced our public witness to a political party or to an ideological tribe. And as a consequence, We have become willfully gullible. We believe anything that fits our narrative. We are happy to accept the false and arbitrary narratives constructed by well-paid sophists and talking point factories. They give us the rhetoric and the alibis to dismiss some of the people and some of the things that God loves without even pricking our conscience. Some would say that they don't have to do racial justice because racial justice is always Marxism. Folks on the other side would say they don't have to stand up for the unborn because pro-lifers don't really care about women anyway. They just want to control them. And we treat these narratives like factual reality. But reality is nuanced, and our narratives rarely are. A nuanced narrative would force us to admit that our opponents might actually have a point sometimes, that we're not without fault. But instead of telling the truth in love, we often tell the truth insofar as it impugns our opponents and serves our interests and cultural preferences. Lord, have mercy on our souls for being so fickle as to praise a righteous and just God in church and then step out into the political arena and put our faith into lesser gods and lesser institutions. We've been given the truth, believers. We've been given a framework for engaging our neighbors and for engaging society at large. And even in the most difficult situation, that framework compels us to speak the truth in love. Let's dig into the scripture a bit. The conversation about engaging politics to better society inevitably must address what teachings we follow and what methods we'll employ to achieve our objectives. Today, many Christians have been seduced by ideologies that are made by human hands and that simply can't withstand biblical scrutiny. The Bible speaks to this. In Ephesians 4, Apostle Paul is talking to the church of Ephesus. The church of Ephesus was known as the persevering church. They had endured a lot of suffering. And they also had false prophets that were trying to infiltrate the church with false teachings. Earlier in Ephesians 4, Paul talks about being mature. And when he talks about being mature, he's talking about growth in mind, growth in understanding, growth in knowledge of the truth, and growth in moral character. So he says that when we mature, or when we grow in understanding, when we grow in knowledge of the truth, when we grow in moral character, then we will no longer be infants. Meaning we will no longer be so malleable. We won't be so impressionable. Tossed back and forth by the waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching. Paul is telling the church of Ephesus that mature Christians aren't easily deceived. That these false teachers wouldn't be able to indoctrinate mature Christians because mature Christians know what they stand for. Regardless of the false teachings that are prominent, regardless of what pop culture is saying, what popular opinion is saying, and regardless of how much we are suffering, mature Christians are able to speak the truth in love. Christians should never let their circumstances or the tactics of their opponents, let me say that again, Christians should never allow the tactics of their opponents to dictate who they are or how they respond. You see, everybody wants to claim the civil rights movement today, but a lot of people don't actually understand one of the primary guiding principles that was part of the civil rights movement. Yes, the civil rights movement was about changing policy and corrupt systems, but there was something underlying that was even more important. And it was the understanding that no matter how bad your opponent was, no matter how bad they treated you, that you could never allow your opponent to have a negative impact on your spirit. You could win the policy battle. You could change the system. But if someone was allowed to have a negative impact on your spirit, then you really lost everything. You see, everybody wants to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., but not everybody wants to talk about how his life taught us that it is better to die than to hate your enemy. We must always be able to speak the truth in love. This doesn't just apply to our personal relationships, but also to our cultural and political interactions. You see, political and social ideologies are not all bad. You shouldn't take that from what I'm saying today. You can decide whether progressivism or conservatism is best in a given situation. But one thing I can tell you is that neither is the gospel, which means they're fallible. We have to stop defending our political ideology and our party like it's inerrant, like it's infallible, because it's not even close. The truth is that the most prominent ideologies that many of us subscribe to often are separating love and truth. They separate them as if they're in conflict or as if they're mutually exclusive. One side is supposedly all about love, while the other side claims to be about truth. And Christians are told to choose between the two. Well, let me tell you today, brothers and sisters, choosing between love and truth is a false choice. That's a false dilemma. A Christian can choose a political party, I'm not saying that, but a Christian cannot choose between love and truth. They are not in conflict. They're actually interdependent. Tim Keller put it this way. He said that love without truth is sentimentality, meaning it's overly emotional. It's lacking in substance. And that truth without love is harshness. It's mean. It's uncompassionate. You see, these ideologies that we follow tend to be either lacking in love or lacking in truth. And as a result, when it comes to political ideology, as I always say, to be conservative or to be progressive at all times and on every single issue is not only intellectually lazy and easily manipulated, I believe that it's not faithful. You see, ideological conservatism and theological conservatism are not always the same thing. The far left's conception of social justice is not always consistent with a biblical understanding. Listen, if we're conservative, when the issue calls for change and the dismantling of old prejudice structures, then we're helping to maintain injustice. But if we're progressive, when the moment calls for the regeneration or the preservation of moral order, then we're complicit in society's rejection of the truth. A Christian cannot simply follow behind a political party or follow behind an ideological tribe. We must be supplying both of them with heavy doses of love and truth if we're going to be who Jesus called us to be. So what I'm trying to give you is a framework which part of it is based on love, part of it is based on truth, and how those two things come together in the gospel and should be applied to the politics today. Let's first look at the love portion of this conversation. It should pain us that other communities can legitimately question whether or not they are loved by Christians, or legitimately question whether the Christian community will treat them fairly. Look, we know that love does not guarantee agreement or affirmation, but it does call us to be concerned about the well-being of others. You can understand systematic theology. You can memorize the entire Bible, and that would be a good thing. But if you're unloving, if you're uncompassionate, then you're not being Christ-like. And this is where some conservatives run into trouble. You see, we've been commanded to love our neighbors as ourselves. And we can't do that if we're not willing to advocate for our neighbors' well-being and to protect their human dignity. That's really all a biblical definition of social justice is. According to the great commandment, if you would want justice for yourself, if you would seek justice for yourself, then you must want it and you must seek it for your neighbor. If we truly love our neighbors, we'll be socially concerned. And that social concern won't just be a sentiment. It'll be active. It'll involve self-sacrifice. You see, I'm sure you've heard the debate. We supposedly have Christians who are against social justice. But let me tell you something. I don't believe them. I think everyone is for social justice. Some of us just limit it to the people that we care about, and we deny it to others because it would inconvenience us. Let me give you an example. No one that I'm talking to today, if we're going to be honest, is going to sit around and watch someone in their family be unjustly imprisoned. No one would allow, no one's going to let someone be unjustly imprisoned who's around them and that they care about if there's something that they can do to stop it. No one would allow their children, the children in their community, to drink lead-poisoned water if there was something they could do to prevent it. And why is that? It's because we believe in social justice. We believe that there's a certain standard by which everyone should be treated based on their human dignity, based on the imago Dei, based on the fact that they were created in the image of God. But see, what we have to understand is and realize is that justice is harder than charity. There is a reason that people will give you charity long before they give you justice. And this is because charity is good, but charity can be distant. And also, the person who gives charity is always in control of how much they give and how much that giving will impact them. But justice is different. Justice, on the other hand, is either given fully or it's not given at all. You see, justice is a God standard. Justice threatens to disrupt the very systems and societal arrangements that benefit us. At some point, justice demands a conflict with self-interest. It dismantles the very podiums and platforms which we place our pride and stand atop to look down on others. Listen, there can be no social renewal without love and social concern. Without it, we'll just create a harsh and hypocritical society that excludes marginalized groups. A Christian public witness must have love, compassion, and social concern as a part of it. Now let's talk about the truth side of this equation. In Ephesians 4:15, the term speak the truth comes from the Greek word that refers to teaching or professing the truth, often as it relates to doctrine. And listen, this is not subjective. The truth is not subjective. Everyone does not have their own separate, individual, independent truth. To speak the truth means to profess right doctrine or to be honest in how you recount events. You have to understand that we worship a God of moral order. God's truth provides us with direction and with structure. In an ever-changing world, God's truth is unchanging. Now, I know that especially for students in the world today, everyone it seems is trying to be progressive. A lot of people are pushing you to be progressive. If you're watching a television, if you're listening to pop culture, the best thing you could be is progressive. But I want to tell you where progressivism can get us into trouble as Christians. Now, to move forward and to fix things can be good. And most people, even myself, when someone says they're progressive, usually that's what they mean, that they want to move forward, that they want to fix things, and we understand that that can be positive. But being progressive is not the answer to every situation. It's not the gospel. Let me give you an illustration. If you're on a cliff, you're on the edge of a cliff, to progress or to even move forward, probably isn't such a good idea. It's also not a good idea to progress if you're already moving in the wrong direction. You see, Christian, sometimes God is asking us to stand firm on his word. Sometimes God is asking us to preserve things and institutions that he has already established as good. Not that need to be made good by us, but that he's already ordained or established as good. Modern thought tells us that we can improve everything. But let me tell you the truth. God's truth cannot be improved. Let me give you another illustration. You can think of God's truth like a Picasso, like a masterpiece. You can't improve a Picasso. You can only deface a Picasso. If you go up to a masterpiece with a brush and some sort of erasing agent, I don't care how good of an artist you think you are. If you add anything to that masterpiece, or if you take anything away from that masterpiece, you've made it worse. You haven't made it better. You've ruined it. And that's the way God's truth works. You can't improve on God's word. You can apply it, but you can't improve it. God doesn't need our counsel. He doesn't need us to improve or evolve his truth. Sometimes what seems good and pleasant to us in the moment, in our time period, is actually destructive, and we wouldn't realize it until centuries or decades later. Sometimes God is calling us to obedience. Sometimes God is simply calling us to self-denial. And that's hard for progressives. That's hard for people who buy into the progressive worldview. It's hard to be obedient and to deny self when you buy into a societal ethic that says that individual expression is sovereign. The question you have to ask yourself is, can Christians fully embrace this philosophy and be faithful? It might be flattering, but you won't find an endorsement of that worldview here. Even if you're one of the people who only wants to read the New Testament, you only want to read the red letters, you won't find Jesus endorsing a human-centered, self-dictated truth or reality. This book tells us to die to self. This book calls us to be crucified with Christ. This book is consistently about self-sacrifice, not self-indulgence. So you may be saying, Justin, are you saying that we can't be a progressive politically? I'm not necessarily saying that. What I'm saying is that when in conflict, when your progressivism comes into conflict with your Christianity, then your Christianity has to override your progressivism. When your conservatism comes into conflict with your Christianity must override your conservatism, because both conservatism and progressivism are flawed. And too often, when we're talking about politics and when we're doing politics, it's our ideology or our party that's controlling, and not Christian convictions. Not the Christian compassion and conviction that we see in Jesus and the gospel. We cannot exchange the truth for confusion. We cannot exchange moral order for chaos. Jesus provided us a model for social renewal that was concerned about marginalized individuals in society. And we as Christians must pursue the same course. But he didn't simply patronize them with sentimentality. He attended to them with love and truth. We can go to John 8, the case of the adulterous woman who was about to be stoned. What does Jesus tell her? He tells her, go. This is Jesus liberating his love, liberating her from these hypocrites who were intent on hurting her. When he says go, this is him releasing her from this societal bondage. But Jesus doesn't stop there. Jesus also says, sin no more. Because the other half of the truth was that she would never completely be free. She would never completely be released from this bondage until her heart changed and until she turned from her sin. Similarly, in John 5, the lame man was told to stand up and walk. And then he's later told to stop sinning. Do you see what's going on here? The woman wasn't only a victim of external bondage, but also her own internal bondage. The man's infirmity wasn't only an outward disability, but there was another matter that had to be dealt with by inward transformation. There's a similar narrative or a similar theme in Exodus. God delivered the Hebrews from Pharaoh's hand, but he doesn't just say, go off and live happily ever after, do whatever you want to do. That's not what he says. That's not the end of the story. After he frees them, after he liberates them, he gives them the law to obey. He demands their obedience after he frees them. He chastises them after giving them freedom. So yes, our God is a liberator, and that's real. But he's also a father that requires moral order from the liberated. He brings wrath upon the oppressor and calls all his children to self-denial so that they don't become the oppressor. But too many Christians have embraced ideologies and political parties that are keen on identifying how others have sinned against us while blinding us to how we're being devoured and devouring others through our own sin. If the adulterous woman were here today, one side of the church would be saying, stone her for she has broken the law. And the other side would be saying, slay queen, live your truth. And both would be leaving her in chains. Both would be leaving her imprisoned. That was not the pedagogic creed of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. He taught us that the unjust and the dishonest will receive God's wrath, and that Christian love is unconditional, but it's not without discernment, that it's not without critique, that it doesn't mean that we affirm all things. There is a way that seems right to man, but ends in death. It is time within our political witness that Christians tighten up our philosophies, that we tighten up our methodologies and our ideologies, and adhere to a gospel standard. If Christians are really going to have something to offer this toxic, this vitriolic discourse, if we're really going to have something to offer the political landscape, then we can't be mere partisans. We can't just be conservatives or secular progressives. We can't just be Democrats or Republicans. We have to be Christians. We have to be distinctive in nature, and we have to bring the compassion and conviction of the gospel to bear. We have to make sure that we bring all this partisanship, that we bring all of this ideology through biblical scrutiny, because the Bible has so much more to say than these ideologies and these parties. Thank you so much for having me. Take care.